Kerete. We're going to do a quick review of some of the Greek verb introduction that we started on last. And we've been noting some things about English verbs, and I may not be getting everything strictly right on the English verbs, but hopefully it's paving the way for where we're going with Greek verbs. And we have seen that English verbs do change a little bit depending on who the person, the subject is, whether it's I, you, he, she, it, they. The verb will sometimes add something to the end, but you still have a stem. And so we're going to be using that basic idea as we move forward. And so a Greek verb will inflect, that is, change form to agree with the subject or subjects. And the stem is the part of the verb that stays the same. Just like I learn, he learns, you add the S, but it doesn't change the meaning of learn. You're just changing the form to agree with the subject. In Greek, they do the same thing, except they do it with every person, singular and plural. So as we think about these changes, what happens in Greek verbs is that you add a personal ending. And the reason it's called a personal ending is because it is now agreeing with the person. I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they. You add this personal ending, which will tell you what the subject of that verb is. Now, if you do that with a Greek verb, and for other languages for that matter are the same, you don't necessarily have to have an expressed subject in Greek. So it could be that you don't have to say ego for I, because if you just have the right ending on the end of the verb, it means I do this. Now, when you don't need a personal pronoun and then you add it in, that might mean that there's a little bit of emphasis being added in Greek. But we'll talk about that more as we go through. We looked at this example where we noticed that our word for love, and this is actually an aorist tense, so it's in the indicative, probably just past, but looking at the whole action, God loved. Now, if you change the subject to a plural, gods, then you're going to have to change the ending. So it would be, instead of sen, it would be san. And so that's how they change. Again, for the purposes of this class, we're going to use the interlinear to tell us what the person is without memorizing all the personal endings. But that's what's happening, just so you're aware of what's happening. If you wanted to ever go further, you'd have to memorize all those endings. All right, so thinking about the inflection, what I have up here are the present active indicative forms of akuo. Now, akuo is a word that means I hear. We get our word acoustics from that. It has to do with sound. But this is a fairly regular verb. And so these endings on regular verbs are going to be consistent all the way through. So it's o, is, I, omen, ete, usi. If you saw akuo in the Greek New Testament, it always means I hear. And the subject is there because the personal ending o is first person singular. So I hear. If you see aku is, that's always going to be you singular here. You singular here. Is tells you it's second person singular. I, here at the end, aku I, is he, she, or it hears. Now here's where you get to some ambiguity in Greek. Because third person singular, for the verb itself, can be a masculine subject, a feminine subject, or a neuter subject. Here's where you would probably need an express subject in the Greek so that you know who you're talking about. What will sometimes happen is you'll have an express subject, like Jesus spoke, and then the very next sentence, he said. So it'll just say, like, lei, he said, in order to, even though you don't have Jesus said again, and you don't have the personal pronoun he there, but it's implied that it's the same subject that you had in the previous verse. Omen is we here, so akuete is you or y'all here. Akusi is they here. And with this they, it's the same as the first person or the third person singular, the third person plural. You have to let context determine, is this a masculine they, a feminine they, or a neuter they? They doesn't tell you. You have to figure it out from the context. All right, so for example, when we look at this sentence here, ta provata, the sheep, ta ema, that is of me, actually the sheep, the mine, my sheep. It's more emphatic than just uh, ta provata mu, which is what we have seen for my, the sheep of me. This is a more emphatic form. Just so that's why they put in the interlinear of me, the sheep of me, my sheep. Tis phonis mu, the voice of me, akousin. Um, don't pay attention to this genitive over here. Just it's kind of like the what is it? The Wizard of Oz. Just ignore that person behind the curtain right now because you don't need to know why this is not normal for a genitive. But what I'm pointing to here is akousin. It's they hear. So you could just have a sentence that says akousin, and I don't have a laser pointer going. Akousin would be a complete sentence. They hear. But you get an express subject because you have a nominative here, nominative plural. If you have a nominative plural, what do you expect? You would expect a they. So you get a third person plural ending on akuo. So they hear, well, who's they? They've told you with the subject, the nominative, the sheep that belong to me. The sheep hear. And then what do they hear? They actually hear my voice. Don't worry that it's a genitive instead of an accusative. And I, this is kago, and I, yinosko, notice that O ending there, and we had an O ending up here. We had yinosko, I know them. I know them. So the main thing I'm pointing out here is that when you had the sheep as the subject, as a nominative, you had third person plural, they hear. When you have I as the nominative, then you have a first person singular as the verb, I hear. Okay. All right, any questions about that? Anything that doesn't make sense as far as that your subject and your verb are going to agree in person and number?
Real quick question, I may have missed it, but when you've got aku Hussein there,
Mm-hmm.
so inside the letter D, then the table it doesn't have that in D. Is there a reason
All right.
for that?
So if we were going to be memorizing endings, what we would note is that in Greek you have what is called a movable knee, which sometimes is referred to as a removable knee because usually it's there. If I were to technically write this out, it would be akusi or akusin. It's the exact same, but again, you guys aren't memorizing endings, so it's not strictly important. All you're going to be looking at is the interlinear that says this is a present, active, indicative, third person plural, and you're not necessarily memorizing the ending. So, any additional questions? All right. So let's talk a little bit about aspect in Greek. And again, we're learning some terminology here. I'm going to try to apply it to some actual verses as we move forward. But we talked about aspect last time, and we talked about how English verbs, the focus is more on time and less on aspect. In Greek, it's more on aspect and less on time. To see if we're kind of getting the idea of aspect, what are we talking about when we say aspect instead of like time with past, present, future? What was aspect?
More continuous action. So, I was running,
Mm-hmm.
and you're expecting continuation.
Right.
Else.
So that's one aspect. You can have continuous aspect. You can also have the whole picture, kind of undefined. So if I say I ran, that's kind of the whole picture. If I say I was running, it's kind of picturing ongoing action in the past. So in Greek, they're more focused on how you think about it happening rather than when it happens. And as I was talking to some of you after class last time, this is just one of those things where we have to start trying to think like Greeks. So we have to learn the terminology, and then we'll see some examples and see how they thought about it, because they don't think about it the same as we do. And that's where we can be very thankful for good translators who think about these aspect ideas. But I want you to at least be familiar with some of the basic elements. So the three major aspects in Greek are continuous, undefined, and perfective. Continuous, undefined, and perfective. We've already talked about two of those. What does continuous mean? It's ongoing. It's ongoing. So, and the illustration I gave is if you had the parade, you're seeing the parade happening. So you have ongoing activity. You're right there viewing the action going before you. Undefined, where are you at? You're up in the blimp. And you are seeing the whole parade. You're not focusing on one element as it passes before you, you're seeing the whole thing. Perfective, let me move forward here. You got trash all over the street. This is in a state of having had a parade go through it. So it is, you know that a parade has gone through, but now you're focused on the state that has come because of it. Really, we could almost put the arrow right there. That's not the perfect illustration. I'm going to give some better illustrations, but to keep the parade idea, this would be seeing it happen before you, seeing the whole action, and then seeing the result of what has happened. So that's how they mainly think about verbs in Greek. So let's look at some examples. Could someone read for us 1 Timothy 2:4? 1 Timothy 2:4. And in this verse, we're going to have a present active indicative verb. That means present, that it is probably present time. It is active, the subject is doing the action. Indicative means that it is the subject, or that indicative is that it's reality. So who's got 1 Timothy 2:4? All right, Jacob.
Who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth.
All right. Desires. This is present tense. Now, I believe that present active indicative means that in that time, at that moment, God actively desires for people to be saved. However, then you have to make a decision with the present tense. Is this undefined or is this progressive? Are we supposed to just view this as God's overarching desire? So God desires? Or are we supposed to view it as ongoing activity of God is desiring for all people to be saved? Cool. Now, I mentioned that to say that really it's probably more of a progressive idea, though we would just translate it, God desires all men to be saved. But it's probably that this is ongoing activity. He wants us to see God as actively in an ongoing way desiring for people to be saved. Now, that's the ambiguity of the present. Because in the present tense in Greek, you have to make a decision in context, is this undefined or is this progressive? Because it's the same form for both ideas. In Greek, with the past tense, as we already noticed, you have an aorist that is almost always undefined, and you have an imperfect that is almost always continuous action. So they split it apart. So there's no ambiguity there. And we'll look at a chart in just a moment. But I just want us to see that the idea is God desires. God is desiring. You can kind of play around with that idea, but what we're focusing on there is the present tense. It is in the present, but it's probably also focusing on the type of action, the ongoing progressive action. Now let's look at 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12. And what we're going to see here is an aorist active participle. Aorist active participle. And the aorist tense is always going to be in this kind of blimp view. So 1 Timothy 1:12, who has that? All right, Trevor.
Thank Christ Jesus our Lord, who has strengthened me, because he considered me faithful, putting me into service.
All right. Who, and I, strengthened is our word there. It's in the aorist tense. It's undefined. He doesn't want you to think about this idea of Jesus is in an ongoing way strengthening me. He would have used a present tense for that. What he wants us to just think is, he's done this. I just want you to think about the idea of, he has strengthened me. Now, when did that happen? Well, in the context, though participles aren't necessarily tied to time necessarily, I think we can tell from the context that he's saying, he has done this. And I want you to think about what he has done for me. So we have present tense is more right here on the street. Aorist tense is more up here looking at the whole action. So desiring versus strengthened. Desiring versus strengthened in these two verses. Now we'll look at a perfective idea in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 2. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 2. Who wants to read that for us? All right.
Speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron.
All right. Could you check to make sure I'm not getting off? Is the word seared my perfect passive participle? Yes, seared is the word. I was almost positive I didn't want to start speaking incorrectly. So seared is a perfect passive participle. We're going to focus on the perfect idea. This is the perfective concept of something that has happened and it has ongoing relevance in the present. So, when were they seared? Well, if this is present time, sometime back here. Don't know exactly, but he doesn't want you to just think seared as the whole general idea. He wants you to think, and that searing has ongoing effect. They are in a state of having been seared. So right now, they are seared people, is kind of the idea. So do you see kind of the difference between seeing the whole action versus seeing what state they are now in? So you had, I've been strengthened. That doesn't mean that Paul doesn't think he has a state of having been strengthened. He just doesn't use the perfect tense because he doesn't want you to think about that. Usually the aorist is kind of the default of, I don't want you to think about aspect at all. I just want you to think about the action. It's undefined. But when he uses a perfect, he wants you to say, yes, they are seared, but now they're in a state of having been seared. He wants you to think about their being, their state.
So are you saying that the searing itself has continued, like as in they haven't left that state? Or are you saying that the searing process itself is continuing to go on?
So, good question. That means that the action has happened. Now in the present, you have the result.
So it's not so much that the searing is continuing to take place, but rather the consequences of the searing.
Exactly. And the example I gave last time is, I have been baptized. If that was a perfect, it's not that I'm in an ongoing baptism at all times, but I am now in a state of being a baptized person because of an event that happened in the past. I am now a baptized person. They are a seared person because of something. They've made a choice in their past to reject God. Their heart has become hardened, and now they are presently seared people. Does that kind of make sense? All right. It'll take some time, and we'll keep reviewing these terms as we think about verbs. But those are the three basic ideas, and we see all of them in 1 Timothy, is that you have the idea of he wants you to think about God's ongoing desire to save people. He wants you to think about how he has been strengthened. And so he was strengthened at one time to perform the ministry that he is now doing. But these people have been seared, and they are now in a state of having been seared. All right. Now, to a question that you didn't ask, but it reminded me, one that we will only briefly talk about that is in the perfective aspect. If this is the perfect, something that has happened that has ongoing relevance, you also have the past tense of that, called the pluperfect, which means if this is the present, you had action that happened in the past, that had ongoing relevance into a certain time, but now it is no longer. This is the tense that John uses in 1 John chapter 2 of they went out from us, but they were not of us. That he uses a couple of pluperfects there to say these people were in a state of having been with us, and now they are no longer with us. They've actually gone out. And so you have some interesting ideas that are hard to express in English that they actually have the vocabulary to do it, to give you that kind of exact thought process of to express that.
And that is expressed in the word?
In the tense. So this is the with the pluperfect in Greek, it would express that. And it's hard to express that in English. Really, it's hard to express the perfect accurately in English. Usually the best we can do is either, for instance, though it's actually a special construction, it has the force of a perfect. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8, for you are saved by grace through faith. Have you ever noticed that some translations say you are saved by grace through faith, and some say you have been saved by grace through faith? It's because it's a perfect construction, and it's talking about salvation that has happened that has ongoing relevance in the present. And so how do you express that in English? Well, you have been saved. Well, maybe that expresses the present ongoing relevance of having been saved, or you could do it in a present. You are saved. So you've been saved in the past, and you are in a state of having been saved. So you can see how the translators have to play around with English to try to express what is in the Greek. All right, any additional thoughts on that? Again, you don't have to don't think that you need to have this memorized now, but we're going to keep hitting it because these are the terms that are going to come up. Because when you're in your interlinear and you see present tense, you need to think, what does Greek mean by present tense? When you see perfect tense, you need to think, what is perfect in the Greek tense or in the Greek language? So let me put a chart up here that may kind of help us see some things. In the present, future, imperfect, aorist, and perfect tenses, if we have those in the indicative, I put normally, this is the time that's being expressed. So if it's a present tense, normally it is present time in Greek. If it's a future tense, it is, you could almost change it for future. Future is always future in Greek, future time. Imperfect is past activity. Aorist is past activity. Perfect is completed in the past with effects felt in the present. So those are your major tenses in Greek, and those are the time elements that go along with them. Now, the aspect of that, and I probably could have done a little bit better on this chart, it could, for the present, it can be undefined or continuous. For the future, it is always undefined. It's actually built on the aorist tense. The imperfect is continuous activity in the past. So if this is the present, I was running. But the aorist is I ran. So you have the undefined and you have the continuous. And then the perfect, we've already illustrated here, of something that happened in the past that has ongoing relevance, ongoing state in the present. And so it's kind of a mixture of undefined and continuous kind of put together with that one. Any questions about that chart? Now, I will say the reason I put normally on the time is because, again, what does Greek focus on? Time or aspect? Aspect. So, since aspect is in the foreground, what you'll find is that you have some present tenses that are actually things that happened in the past and some present tenses that occur in the future. And you have some aorists that happen in the past, but you have some that happen in the present and some that happen in the future. And you have to let context determine what is the time here, because the focus is more on aspect. For an example, in Romans chapter 8, it says, those whom he called, he also justified, those whom he justified, I mixed that up, but it says, Those whom he predestined, he also called. Those whom he called, he also justified. Those whom he justified, he also what? Glorified. Are we already in a state of glory, in consummate glory? No. But he uses an aorist there, probably a futuristic aorist, to say it's as good as done. But he uses an aorist. And so he's focusing more on the aspect. He just wants you to think about the idea of glory. He wants you to see that from the blimp. And even though it's happening in the future, he uses an aorist so that you can get that undefined concept, focusing more on the verb, the meaning of the verb itself. So, any comments, questions?
I guess I see what you mean by undefined. I didn't get it until then. I thought of undefined being a point. Well, that's defined. But you're saying
It's a
nebulous.
yeah. Take the word undefined away from any kind of time concept. It's undefined as what the Greek grammarians are usually meaning is it's undefined in that it's not progressive. Is basically the idea. It's holistic. Is usually some of the words that word is sometimes used as well. Any other thoughts?
Just, you talk about how can you use a present when it's actually in the future, or perfect when it's actually in the future? I was thinking, well, we can do the same thing. Maybe somebody's giving me some directions to go someplace, and I say, okay, so I go down 6th Avenue, and do I turn up the second or the third light? And I'm speaking in the present, but clearly I'm talking about something
Right.
in the future.
Absolutely. Yep. Exactly. Good connection. Any other thoughts? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about each of these and see some examples. So present indicative. Again, present, we've already been talking about. Let's just review. What does indicative mean? The way it is. We're talking about reality, not as a may do this. This is happening type idea. So present indicative, action that generally occurs in the present. Let's look at Philippians chapter 1 and verse 15. Philippians 1:15. Who's got that for us? All right. Thank you, Mike.
Some of you preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill.
All right. So what is our verb, our first verb there? Preach. And when are they preaching? Yeah, currently. He's saying there are currently people who are preaching while I'm in prison. But the focus is also, this is activity that is happening. It's ongoing, that they are preaching in the present time, but they are preaching is kind of the idea. Now, you could, again, with the present tense, you have to make a decision. Does he want you to see as ongoing progressive? Or does he want you to just think, people are preaching. People preach while I'm here in prison. Again, there's some ambiguity there, and you have to decide what you think is best, or that's where it's good to have a good commentary that actually knows something about Greek that can kind of work, maybe present some arguments that might be helpful. All right, future indicative. This is usually activity that occurs, or it will occur in the future. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 1. Someone read that for us, please.
Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons.
All right. So what's going to happen in the future? Some will depart. Now, in Greek, they have a stem and an ending that will tell you this is a future. In English, how do we relate futures? Yeah, we have to have a helper word. We have to say, will do this. Will is not actually in the Greek text. We can't do a word for word there. We have to add in an English word because that's how we relate future tense. And so we have here, some will depart. Now he's saying this will happen. When will it happen? Future. Future tense is always future. All right, next, let's think about the imperfect. The imperfect indicative.
That holding back takes as much up as
Imperfect indicative. Let's read first, or Mark chapter 1 and verse 21. Who's got that? Mark.
And they went to Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered into the synagogue and taught.
Okay. Look in your interlinear there. Where do we have an imperfect? Look for, I think you've got 2 or 3 verbs there. All right. Began to teach. Does anyone's translation say anything other than began to teach?
One says he taught.
And taught. So it's interesting here. So what's the verb right before that? He went, he entered. And what tense is that? All right. So entered is aorist. And some translations say taught. This is an imperfect. This is a good comparison. Does aorist want you to think of ongoing repeated action? No, it just wants you to think he entered, but the imperfect, still in the past, but not just from the blimp, it wants you to see the parade as it passes by. He taught, he was teaching. Some translations say he began to teach. And the reason they can do that is because if you have the present time here and you have this activity that they want you to think about, he entered, think about the whole action, and he was teaching. Well, if you have kind of a set point of he entered, but you want to focus on progressive activity of teaching, you can have in Greek what's called an inceptive imperfect, which means it gives you the beginning and then focuses on the ongoing activity that follows. So you do have a beginning point, but focus on the whole activity that's happening. So this in English just looks like 2 simple past tenses. He entered, he taught. But what the author wants you to think is he entered and he began to teach and kept on teaching in those places. So it's giving you a little bit of flavor there. It's giving you a little color to the black and white picture that you can begin to almost see Jesus begin teaching. And he just keeps, and he's teaching in those synagogues. All right. Any questions about that?
It is interesting to me that it's not a verb as we think of it, it's a participle.
Oh, yeah. Which one is the?
Entered.
Yeah, entered.
So I guess to get a little more literal, it would almost have been an entering into the synagogue he taught.
Yeah. So, and what we're going to learn with participles, here's you some second year, I'll give you first year Greek and then I'll give you second year Greek. So first year Greek would be that with the aorist participle, it's having entered, he was teaching. Or, better yet, after he entered, he began to teach, or he was teaching. Second year Greek is that with an aorist participle that precedes an indicative verb, especially in narrative, you can have that it can be called a tendent circumstance, which means then in English you can translate it as a finite verb of he entered and did that. So that's your second year Greek, kind of thrown in for free. All right. But the main thing I want you to see here is that we have 2 concepts. You have an aorist tense, even though it's a participle. It's an aorist because it just wants you to see the whole act. Just think entered. But when you see the imperfect, he's teaching. He's teaching. All right. But both of those are occurring in past time from the time that this was being written. So that's why in English we would say he entered and was teaching, because it is past time by the context. Any questions about that?
So the next verse in Mark focuses on their reaction, what happens to the teaching. Is that part of the reason why that it's in this tense, because it's focusing on what happened while he was teaching?
Yeah, that may well be. I haven't dug in enough to think through the grammar there. Any additional thoughts on that? All right, Mark 1:4. Just go back a couple of verses. Here we're going to focus in on the aorist this time. What does Mark 1:4 say?
John came baptizing in the wilderness and preaching a baptism of repentance for the remission of sins.
All right. Since I know you have the interlinear up, what? I thought you did. Sorry. You have it available. What? Where is our first aorist verb? Anybody that has it open can. Sorry. Came. Very good. But then he came, and what was he doing? Baptizing. Now, that is a participle, but what tense participle is that? Present. The author wants you to think, I just want you to think John the Baptist came. I don't want you to envision him coming out of the wilderness and coming up to this place. I just want you to know he came. But what I do want you to know is that he was baptizing. And so you have that continuous idea of something he repeated. So he came, but then he was an ongoing activity. Now, what we'll get to with participles is there is no imperfect participle. That's why you put it in the present, so that you can get the progressive idea of he was baptizing. All right. And now let's go to the perfect indicative, an action that was brought to completion whose effects are felt in the present from the standpoint of the speaker. Let's look at Mark 9:13. Someone read that for us? Mark 9:13.
But I say to you that Elijah has indeed come, and they did to him whatever they wished, just as it is written of him.
All right, where is our perfect here? Can anyone find the perfect verb in your interlinear? Has indeed come. So the verb is just has come. Now, up here we had he came. And that was talking about John the Baptist, right? But he didn't want you to focus on the progressive activity. He didn't even want you to think about the state of having come. He gave you an aorist. But here he said has come. And he is talking about John the Baptist, though he says it as Elijah. But what's the difference between this aorist came and this perfect has come? Based on what you know about Greek so far. Yeah, he came, and now I want you to focus on the results of him having come. So see how there's just a slight difference between those two ideas, that you have he came, just think about the action. He came, think about the results. That's the major difference in Greek. All right? Any additional thoughts on that? Anything that just does not make any sense whatsoever yet? It's okay if you feel the fog, but we're just learning the terminology right now. I just want you to start getting introduced to these ideas of how they use these different tenses. But if anyone is having any difficulty just understanding the basic concept so far, let me know and I'll try to explain a little better. All right. Well, the bell's about to ring. What we're going to do next time is take what we're learning, and I'll email out the slides so that you can go remind yourself. Your assignment is to think present tense. Oh yeah, that's action that probably happens in the present, but it's usually ongoing activity. But aorist tense, oh yeah, that's undefined, usually past. Imperfect, that's continuous action that happened in the past for the most part. Perfect, I want you to think about results. So get some key words to tie your English knowledge to your Greek knowledge. And then what we'll move into next time is mood. And we'll just briefly talk about the mood of a verb. Basically, this is the indicative mood is what we're going to be focusing in on. And then our exercise is going to be, just as we looked for the verbs in 1 John 1 through 10 in English, now we're going to do that same thing and see if we can figure out anything about those verbs in the Greek from our interlinear. All right, appreciate everyone's participation.